Hi, friends. Great to see you back on our Flutter course. Today, we'll continue exploring classes in Flutter, diving deeper into constructors and fields within classes. If you haven't watched the previous lesson where we covered the basic concepts of classes, I recommend going back to watch it for a better understanding of today's topic. We'll start with the concept of nullable. In programming, null is a special value that signifies the absence of data or an undefined state of a variable. When a variable is null, it means it doesn't point to any value. Previously, when we created variables, we made them non-nullable, meaning they couldn't be equal to null. To create a variable that can hold null, you need to add a question mark after its type. This indicates that the variable can be null. Let's discuss the differences. In Dart, when we create a variable without specifying that it's nullable, for example by using the question mark, it is non-nullable by default. This means such a variable must be initialized before its first use. We don't have to do this immediately upon declaration, but it must be initialized before it is accessed within the scope of curly braces, for example within a method. Now, let's talk about constructors. In the last lesson, we were introduced to constructors but didn't explore their purpose in detail. A constructor in Dart is called when creating an object and is responsible for initializing its fields. Let's start with constructor parameters. Note that the information we'll cover also applies to function parameters. There are several types of parameters. In previous lessons, we only dealt with positional parameters, which require passing arguments in a specific order. You've seen how they look in examples. Now, let's focus on named parameters. Named parameters allow you to pass arguments in any order, making the code more readable and flexible. Instead of passing values in a strict order as with positional parameters, you specify parameter names when calling a function or constructor. This is especially useful if a function or constructor has many parameters and you only want to set values for some of them. Named parameters are enclosed in curly braces. If variables are not marked as nullable, that is, are non-nullable, you must use the required keyword. This keyword ensures that the parameter must be provided when calling the constructor or method. If the parameter is nullable, you can omit the required keyword. When calling a method or constructor, you pass parameters in any order by specifying the name and value with a colon. You can also provide a default value for a parameter using an equal sign. In this case, if a value is not provided, the parameter will take the default value. For parameters with default values, using the required keyword is not necessary. In addition to named parameters, there are other ways to make parameters optional. For example, you can use square brackets. This method is less common but still useful to know. By listing parameters in square brackets, you can omit them, but the order remains important. You must also provide a default value for such parameters. Let's move on to constructor types. In the last lesson, we covered the regular constructor, which is called using the class name. However, there are also named constructors, which are additional constructors that we can name as we wish. You can use multiple named constructors in one class. This is useful if you need to create an object in different ways. Here's how it looks. It is declared using a dot after the class name and is called in the same way. You can use a colon after parameters to override values. For example, if you have a variable ID that should consist of a person's first and last name, you can use a colon to set it during initialization. Here's how this is done. Another example of using this with a named constructor is if you have a class shape with width and height fields. You can create a named parameter for squares to eliminate the need to pass two parameters since a square's width and height are the same. Instead, you can accept a single parameter for size and use the colon to set both width and height. Here's how this looks. Alternatively, you can use curly braces right after the parameters to set values. Here's how it would look in the shape example. This method also allows you to write code inside the constructor. For example, you can write a check to ensure that the size cannot be negative. If someone passes a negative size, it will be set to 10. Now, I'd like you to complete a task. I'll tell you up front that it's a challenging task, so if you can't solve it, don't worry, as the topic is not easy. The task is to create a person class with fields ID, first name, last name as strings, and a username field that will be a nullable string. You need to use all the constructors and parameter types we covered, and you can use them as you like. Pause the video and try to solve it. Solution: to solve this task, create a person class with the required parameters. Note that the username field is marked with a question mark, indicating that it's nullable. Start with a regular constructor. List first name and last name inside curly braces, making them named parameters. We don't list ID because we'll initialize it based on the first and last name. Then, using a colon, set ID to a value consisting of the first and last name. Note that we haven't used username. If it were not nullable, this would highlight an error because all non-nullable fields must be initialized in the constructor. Now, move to the next constructor, the named one. Let's call it with username. This time, let the parameters be optional but named. So we avoid using the required keyword but provide default values. This time include username. Like in the previous constructor, we'll manually assign ID based on the first and last name. Let's test our class. First, create an instance using the regular constructor and try to print its username to the console. Note how I pass parameters using their names and a colon. As we see, null, as we didn't assign anything to it. Instead, let's print the first name, last name, and ID. Running the code, everything works as expected. Now, create an instance using the named constructor. Access it through the class name and a dot. Note that I deliberately won't specify the last name to demonstrate how default parameters work. Let's try to print the information to the console. As you can see, this time there's no null. We've covered the main types of constructors, such as regular, named, and initializer, and learned how to work with nullable fields. These concepts will help you create more flexible and functional classes in your Flutter applications. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss new videos. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments and I'll be sure to answer. See you in the next lesson.